the same sort of attitude, you know, and every one of us really, like Elton and the Stones and George and all of the guys, really, they're much more mellow now.
What if the most scandalous, jaw-dropping, emotionally devastating friendship in rock history wasn't between rivals, but between two men who shared the same stage, the same sound, and shockingly, the same wife? Eric Clapton is 80 years old, and the bombshell truths he's revealed about his bond with George Harrison, the guilt, the obsession, the unspeakable grief, are finally coming to light. Buckle up, because nothing about this story is what you think. Let's set the scene. It's December 1964. Britain is in the grip of full-blown Beatlemania. Every screaming teenager in the country thinks the Fab Four are gods walking among mortals. And into that electric atmosphere steps a 19-year-old Eric Clapton, already being whispered about as something extraordinary, as the lead guitarist of the Yardbirds, opening for the biggest band on the planet. That's where it all began. That first electric meeting between two young guitarists who would go on to shape the sound of an entire generation. George Harrison and Eric Clapton are two of the greatest guitarists of all time, and beyond that, they were great friends. Their friendship would endure even after Harrison's wife, Pattie Boyd, left him and married Clapton. But in 1964, none of that chaos was even imaginable. These were just two guitar-obsessed young men, eyeing each other across a crowded stage. Here's the delicious detail that most people overlook. Clapton didn't even consider Harrison a friend at first. Not even close. Though Harrison was a frequent visitor to Clapton's London home in the late 1960s, Clapton wrote in his autobiography that he had simply considered Harrison a fellow musician. Not a confidant, not a brother, just another guy with a guitar who kept showing up. But then something shifted. Something raw and real began to crack through the surface of two men who were both, in their own ways, painfully uncomfortable expressing themselves in words. Their friendship began to form during sessions at Harrison's house in Esher, where the two would play guitars and take acid together. Bit by bit, something genuine began to grow. Acid, guitars, Esher. Only in the 1960s, people. Only in the 1960s. But here's the question burning in the back of everyone's mind. If these two men were just casual acquaintances, how on earth did one of them end up playing guitar on the most iconic Beatles recording in history? The Abbey Road invitation that stunned the music world. By 1968, the Beatles were quietly imploding. The sessions for what would become the White Album were poisonous, thick with tension, bruised egos, and bandmates who could barely stand to be in the same room. John and Paul dominated everything. Ringo had already quit once and come back. And George Harrison, the quiet, spiritual, perpetually underestimated Beatle, was drowning. He had written something extraordinary, a song called "While My Guitar Gently Weeps." But his bandmates weren't buying it. The lack of camaraderie within the Beatles was reflected in the band's initial apathy towards the composition. Harrison countered by inviting his friend and occasional collaborator, Eric Clapton, to contribute to the recording. This was Harrison's masterstroke. Bring in an outsider so brilliant, so respected, that even Lennon and McCartney would have to sit up and behave. There was just one problem. Clapton didn't want to do it. Even Clapton was surprised when Harrison made the invitation, reportedly saying, "I can't do that. Nobody ever plays on the Beatles' records." And what did Harrison say? According to Clapton's own account, "Look, it's my song, and I want you to play on it." That was it. No begging, no lengthy persuasion campaign, just Harrison's quietly unshakable certainty. And sure enough, once Clapton arrived in the studio, the other Beatles were, as Harrison described it, as good as gold. Think about that for a second. The mere presence of Eric Clapton was enough to make John Lennon and Paul McCartney pull themselves together and behave professionally. That tells you everything about the kind of gravitational force Clapton had in that world, and about Harrison's genius in harnessing it. When applied to Clapton's electric guitar part, which he played on Harrison's Lucy Les Paul, a studio effect gave his solo its peculiar wobbling sound. The result? One of the most beloved guitar solos in the history of popular music. And yet Clapton was not formally credited anywhere on the album. Not a single mention. Not his name, not a thank you. George got his result. And Eric, typically, stoically, walked away in silence. So these two men had forged something real. A creative brotherhood built on mutual respect, artistic admiration, and yes, a lot of late nights in Esher. But here's where it gets deeply, scandalously complicated. Because lurking in the background of this beautiful friendship was a woman, and she was about to change absolutely everything. Pattie Boyd, the woman who set everything on fire. Her name was Pattie Boyd. She was impossibly beautiful, a leading international model, and she had captured George Harrison's heart completely. George and Pattie met on the set of A Hard Day's Night in 1964, fell in love, and married in 1966. From the outside, they looked like the golden couple of the rock world, the spiritual Beatle and his radiant muse. But behind closed doors, things were falling apart. And Eric Clapton, Harrison's closest friend, his musical brother, the man who played on his most personal song, was slowly, helplessly, catastrophically falling in love with her. As Clapton spent more and more time at the Harrison home, his feelings for Pattie grew. In an attempt to suppress his infatuation, he briefly dated her sister, Paula. But it didn't work, and his desperation eventually reached a boiling point when he wrote Layla as a desperate plea for her to leave George for him. Let that sink in. He wrote one of the greatest rock songs ever recorded as a love letter. A reckless, anguished, howling love letter to his best friend's wife. The song was inspired by a 7th-century Persian tale of a young man driven mad by unattainable love, a story that Clapton found deeply personal because it mirrored his own desperate feelings for Boyd. And then, in a moment of breathtaking audacity, Clapton confronted Harrison directly. One evening, while Pattie was present, Clapton reportedly looked Harrison in the eye and said something that would have ended most friendships permanently. Pattie Boyd herself recounted the night to Rolling Stone. To my horror, Eric said, "I have to tell you, man, that I'm in love with your wife." There it was, out in the open. No more circling. No more coded guitar duels or cryptic song lyrics. The truth, raw and ugly, placed directly between two friends. And what did Harrison do? He handed Clapton a guitar. Boyd recalled that Harrison handed Clapton an amp and guitar, as she put it, as an 18th-century gentleman might have handed his rival a sword. And for 2 hours, without a single word, they dueled on their guitars. At the end, the general feeling was that Eric had won. Even drunk, his playing was considered unbeatable. Rock and roll's most extraordinary and gentlemanly duel. No fists, no screaming, just two of the greatest guitarists alive, letting their instruments say everything that words couldn't. But if you think that confrontation ended the story, or even cooled things down, you have absolutely no idea how deep this rabbit hole goes. Because what happened next wasn't just shocking. It was, by rock and roll standards, almost incomprehensibly graceful. The affair, the divorce, and the most civilized love triangle in history. George and Pattie separated in 1974. and their divorce was finalized in 1977. Boyd later said her decision to end the marriage was largely due to George's repeated infidelities, the final straw being an affair with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen. George, it turned out, had been far from a perfect husband. The spiritual seeker, the devotee of transcendental meditation, the man who wrote Something, one of the most beautiful love songs ever recorded, had been straying for years. And when Patty finally told George she was leaving him for Eric Clapton, his response was one for the ages. George reportedly said, "Well, I'm glad you're going off with Eric instead of some idiot." There it is. That is either the most enlightened response in the history of romantic heartbreak or the most savagely passive-aggressive thing ever said with a smile. Possibly both. Patty and Eric eventually married in 1979, during a concert stop in Tucson, Arizona, and George Harrison attended the wedding party, alongside former Beatles bandmates Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney. Harrison was the best man. At the wedding of the man who had spent years in obsessive love with his wife, who had written the most famous unrequited love anthem in rock history about her, and who ultimately married her, George Harrison stood in the front row and celebrated with them. In his autobiography, Clapton wrote that his original motivation had been a mixture of lust and envy, but that it had all changed once he truly got to know Patty. Later, after Clapton and Boyd's own marriage collapsed in 1989, Patty would offer a more pointed assessment. She concluded, "Eric just wanted what George had." 5 words. Devastating, and perhaps more honest than anything Clapton ever wrote in a song. So after the affair, the confrontation, the divorce, and the wedding, did the friendship survive? And more importantly, what did Clapton really think about the man he had simultaneously betrayed and idolized for decades? Because the things Eric has said about George, publicly and privately, reveal a bond far more complex and far more tender than anyone ever realized. Brothers in music. The truth about what they meant to each other. Here is the truth that gets lost in all the soap opera. Clapton and Harrison were, at their core, profoundly, devotedly in love. Not romantically, but in the way that only two people who see directly into each other's souls can be. In a 1991 Rolling Stone interview, Clapton described the friendship with striking vulnerability. "He's like my older brother, really. When I'm around him, I always feel like I've got to do a bit better than I normally would." That single quote tells you everything. This wasn't the boastful camaraderie of rock stars backslapping each other at award shows. This was the quietly terrifying admiration one supremely gifted man had for another. A constant, productive, electric pressure to be better. Their musical collaboration was relentless. They co-wrote Badge for Cream's final album. Clapton appeared on Harrison's solo album Journeyman. They performed together at the concert for Bangladesh. Harrison played on Clapton's recordings, and Clapton appeared on Harrison's in return, an almost unbroken musical conversation spanning decades. In December 1991, Harrison joined Clapton for a celebrated tour of Japan, Harrison's first tour since 1974, and one that no others followed. Two legends sharing a stage, playing to sold-out arenas. By this point, they had been through more together than most people experience in a lifetime. And yet, and this is the part that Clapton has only recently, rawly admitted, despite all of it, he could never quite tell George how he truly felt. "A lot of times during our relationship, I found it very difficult to communicate my feelings toward George," Clapton confessed. "My love for him as a musician and a brother and a friend, because we skated around stuff. Two stoic, emotionally armored men. two British guitar legends who could pour their entire hearts into a six-string but could barely say, "I love you, mate," to each other's faces. There is something deeply, achingly human about that. And then, suddenly, shatteringly, there was no more time left to say any of it, because in 2001, George Harrison was gone. And what Eric Clapton did next revealed just how profoundly that loss broke him open. The death of George Harrison and the grief. Clapton couldn't hide. November 29th, 2001. George Harrison died of lung cancer at the age of 58, and Eric Clapton, the man who had known him for nearly 4 decades, loved him, competed with him, betrayed him, forgiven him, and been forgiven, was in Japan when it happened. Clapton was stunned by Harrison's death because he had no idea how ill his friend truly was. He later said, "The saddest part was that I had no inkling how ill he was. I was actually in Japan when he died." And the guilt was immediate, crushing, because Clapton knew that in the final years of George's life, the friendship had drifted. After Harrison was violently stabbed by an intruder at his Friar Park home in 1999, his fear of further attacks became so intense that he effectively withdrew, hiding away in his high-security Henley-on-Thames estate, barely seeing anyone. Clapton, by his own admission, hadn't attended to the relationship the way he should have. He'd let time pass, let calls go unreturned, let months blur into seasons. And then, without warning, the phone call came that said it was all over. Clapton later admitted, "I didn't attend to the relationship, but it was still there." But still there wasn't enough. And now it was too late. What do you do with that grief? What do you do with decades of unspoken love and guilt and admiration and history when the person it belongs to is suddenly, permanently gone? Eric Clapton did what George Harrison himself would probably have hated, but what Clapton desperately, existentially needed. He organized a concert. The concert for George, a goodbye that was really for Eric. On November 29th, 2002, exactly 1 year after Harrison's death, a galaxy of musical talent gathered at London's Royal Albert Hall. Led by Eric Clapton, the lineup included Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Jeff Lynne, Ravi Shankar, Tom Petty, and Billy Preston, all there to celebrate their beloved friend. It was Clapton's idea entirely. Harrison's widow Olivia later said, "He phoned me not long after George died and said, 'I'd like to do something.' Eric was a very deep friend of George's, so I felt confident and relieved that it was Eric coming to me." But here's the bombshell admission. In a moment of startling, un-rock star-like vulnerability, Clapton told the truth about why he really did it. "I thought that if he were here, he'd probably say, 'Thanks very much, Eric, but I don't really want this,'" Clapton admitted. "And I then thought, well, I'm doing this for me, actually." That's more the truth of it. I needed to do it for him, but it was for me, most of all, because I needed to be able to express my grief in that kind of way. For me, not for George. For me, that is one of the most honest things any public figure has said about grief, loss, and the complicated, selfish, magnificent need we have to mark the passing of someone we love. The concert reunited Clapton, McCartney, and Starr for a legendary performance of "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," the song that had first bound Harrison and Clapton together in that Abbey Road studio all those years ago. The circle, heartbreaking and beautiful, was complete. So what is the final truth? After all the music, the betrayal, the forgiveness, the guitar duels and the love songs, and the decades of skating around feelings, what does Eric Clapton, at 80 years old, finally want the world to know about George Harrison? what Clapton has been carrying all along. Here is what Eric Clapton has been telling us piece by piece, through interviews and memoirs and concerts and confessions scattered across 60 years. He loved George Harrison completely, unreservedly, imperfectly. He loved him the way you love someone who makes you want to be better, someone whose mere presence raises your game and sharpens your soul. He loved him the way that men of their generation almost never allowed themselves to say out loud. And he let him down. He pursued his wife with the obsessive ferocity of a man who, as Patty herself put it, simply wanted what George had. He let the friendship drift in its final years. He was in Japan when George took his last breath, and he has been living with all of that ever since. Clapton has said plainly that communicating his feelings toward George, my love for him as a musician and a brother and a friend, was something he consistently failed to do because they skated around stuff. But the music never lied. Every time Clapton picked up a guitar and played "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," that song born from Harrison's loneliness inside the Beatles, brought to life by Clapton's extraordinary hands, he was saying everything he couldn't say in words. Every note of that solo is a love letter. Every performance a reckoning. Harrison once said of their friendship, "There's this total support. He's like my older brother, really. I love him very dearly, and I know he loves me, but it's like we're always testing each other. Always testing, always pushing, always, just beneath the jostling and the competition and the spectacular human mess of it all, loving each other." That is the truth Eric Clapton has been telling for decades, not in press releases or polished interviews, but in every concert, every tribute, every unguarded admission that slips out when the armor comes down. George Harrison was the most important friendship of his life, and the most complicated, and the most irreplaceable. And no amount of guitar playing, not even the most transcendent, soul-shaking, tear-your-heart-out solo ever committed to tape, has ever been quite enough to fill that silence. That, right there, is one of the greatest, most scandalous, most achingly human stories in the entire history of rock and roll. Two legends, one woman. A friendship that should have been destroyed, and somehow, stubbornly, magnificently, wasn't. If this story hit you the way it hit me, smash that like button and drop a comment below. Tell me, do you think Eric Clapton ever truly made peace with everything that happened between him and George? I want to know what you think. And if you want more deep dives into the untold, unfiltered, gloriously messy truths behind rock's greatest legends, subscribe, because we're just getting started.